Yeah, so I guess before we begin, just an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And Julie wanted to say something briefly.
During the course of this talk, we'll be interrogating a lot of law, a lot of what the law is, what the law says, and it's really important for us as settlers on Kulin Nation that we consider how can this law have any sense of legitimacy on stolen land. And this is what we're going to say. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Cool. So thanks everyone for coming once again. So the nature of this talk is in some ways straightforward and in some ways very complex and confusing. So as you may have seen from the title of the talk, it is the ethics of being online. And I suppose I was interested in this question because I feel like there is very little attention that is paid to the way people are socialized to use the internet and on how to develop their characters online and how to relate to others online. I feel like the majority of socialization occurs for real life interpersonal stuff. That was one motivation. And also, Julie and I have had some chats about what's been happening in the world outside the kind of safe boundaries of Western patrolled, policed internet use. And there are some things that we will talk about outside the West, internet use outside the West. So I'll give you a brief rundown of the structure of the talk. Initially, we're going to ask I guess more of a philosophical, an abstract philosophical question, and that is about the nature of being online and what being online actually looks like and what form it takes, whether it takes a form, whether it's any different to being offline, as in interpersonal connection. And then we will look at some of the real-world consequences of the internet, and of being online, and of how people relate to each other. Do you think that was sufficient?
That was excellent.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question is, what is being online? This is an unanswerable question, partly because of the subjectivity of it. I guess each person has their own way of navigating the online world. Some people use social media, some people don't. And with that in mind, I thought it would be helpful to split being online into two different categories. Or two different selves, because I think there are two important selves that exist online. There is the social media self, and then there is the kind of curious internet exploring self, which I think is quite a different self from the internet self. The kind of exploring browser, Google search self. So I guess I'll give you some brief description of each category, because I think this will be a category, these two categories will be things that we bounce off through a lot of the talk, and then I'll pass it over to Julie. But in my eyes, a key difference between the social media self and the kind of curious internet searching self is that one is more clearly a projection. The social media self is, I guess, a more curated version of the self that exists in amongst others who are also aware that they are existing in amongst others. And that's quite different from, I guess, the non-social media self, which I thought was more libidinous and more driven by impulses and more free, and I guess in this sense more authentic, because it isn't trying to regulate within the confines of, normal social media use. Maybe a little bit more on that in a sec, but how do you feel about this binary?
Well, I wanted to ask you, maybe we'll come back to that in a second, given that what your social media self looks like. But I think what's important that you bring up is this question of there are confines. We're not given a handbook or any sort of guide to how to use the internet in a manner that is ethical, that is responsible. All we have is pressure. And within that, there are certain confines that exist for some that do not exist for others. And so where I'm coming from, in all of my work, I should have perhaps introduced myself.
Yeah, sorry. Neither of us introduced ourselves.
Maybe you should introduce yourself.
I feel like maybe it's a good time to do that because
That's
a
a
few
good
new
segue.
people have rocked up. So
Yes.
I'm sorry. I guess I saw some familiar faces and forgot to introduce myself.
We're all friends here.
It's all your fault. Okay, briefly. Hi, I'm Alex. I have a podcast called Aleks Listens. I work on that a bit. I talk about philosophy and politics and race and that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I've recently just finished my Bachelor of Arts, which took up years. And now I'm free and don't know what to do with my time, but hoping to, do some more philosophy-related stuff like these talks. And who are you?
My name is Julie. My pronouns are she and her. And all of my work is centrally concerned with criminalization, migration, and governance of queer people in the Middle East and North Africa. I am Egyptian and big gay, very homosexual. And so when we're talking about, I'm going to go back to your original question, the segue was, when we're talking about the representation of yourself online versus offline versus your internet browsing self, for some, in the North African context, in the Egyptian context, there absolutely are confines, state confines, that we in the West are not subjected to. We have this seemingly endless supply of information, access to whatever you could possibly want. In first year of uni, I heard the word genderqueer for the first time. I heard a lot of new terms from the queer space for the first time. And I was really able to quite easily go ahead and search them. What do they mean? I can look up interviews with people. I can see how people understand and make sense of these terms for themselves. In the Egyptian context, there are confines within this. If you search certain search terms, you are at risk. If you represent certain search terms, you are at risk. Let alone if you put yourself out there publicly, you are at risk. And so the online space is very much as we like to think of it as a private space that you can regulate, it's definitely not for a lot of groups. And so that's really what I want to draw out throughout this discussion. Recently on Twitter, someone reached out to me. Her name was also Julie Youssef, and I have a very common surname. Youssef is the fourth most common surname in Egypt. But another Julie Youssef reached out to me on Twitter through an alias Twitter handle, and she said, hey, I just saw all this work that you did, I think it's so cool that you teach here. I'm also queer, and I live in Egypt, and I'm also Coptic, and I'm 13 years old. And I can't interact with you on Twitter in the same way that I would like to. I would love to engage with what you're posting, but I literally cannot. Recently, a bunch of her friends were rounded up by the SSSP, the Supreme State Security Prosecution, which had been going through TikTok and Twitter and going through the queer hashtags and finding queer young people on Egyptian TikToks and outing them, putting them at risk, dragging them to their parents, dragging them to security prosecutions. And so we're seeing that the online space has some very, very, very real-life consequences.
Yeah, right. And I suppose one thing that I wanted to do initially before turning to the Middle East, North Africa region, which will be, I guess, the focus of the second half of the talk, was outline some key differences between, I guess, expectations that we have as Westerners using the internet in the West compared to how internet is used elsewhere. And I guess, Julie, that is, a harrowing example of how, I guess, draconian policing of the internet can really stifle people's freedom of identity expression. And
I think that you and I have had some very interesting conversations about this because you and I use the internet in markedly different ways. You have a podcast, you reach out to a lot of really well-known people, and your entire brand is, your head. It's Aleks Listens. It's Aleks engages with these people. And so I would imagine that you are navigating a number of different challenges compared to the way that I use it, where I'm navigating a number of different challenges that are completely sort of different. Mine are sort of navigating a private, dark nether region of the internet where who is allowed to be seen here anonymously.
Yeah, right. And
safely.
obviously you do that for your research for universities? Or is that what you do in your spare time?
It's both.
Okay.
It takes up a lot of time, but yeah, mostly through work.
Okay. Yeah, well, I guess briefly, I, in the past few years, have had the strange fortune of being able to cultivate some kind of online personality. And I made the choice quite early on that I didn't want it to be insincere, which is probably maybe understood as an arrogant way of approaching the internet. But I wanted to have a project which kind of engaged with questions that I was interested in the most authentic way possible. And as Julie said, I contact people and interview them. That's what I've done a few times. There have been a few philosophers and other people. And I try and interview them as I would interview you, a friend, someone who I feel comfortable and safe around.
Does that feel sincere if you don't already have a strong relationship with the person that you're interviewing?
Yeah. Well, often there has been a strange tension in interviews where I have assumed this level of comfort with this person that I know nothing about and have kind of treated them in this more casual way. Some people have been more receptive to it than others. And it's gone, I guess some interviews have been smoother than others, but I think it's been sincere mostly. I think I have in like describing myself in emails to people who who I hope to interview, I guess I've told them like true and important things about myself. And I think this isn't me tooting my own horn, but I don't think that there are too many people who have, at least too many podcasters who closely link their personal identity with the project they're doing. Because I don't think there are too many podcasters whose podcasts tell their own story. I guess a lot of it is commercial, and there's I don't know, you work for a radio station or something and you're given scripts and stuff to talk about.
Well, I had my supervisor tell me a few years ago that academia is really just people wanting to learn their own stories and wanting to represent their world in a manner that makes more sense to them.
Yeah, right. And the focus of this talk wasn't to talk about my podcast, but one cool thing you can listen to it all you like, it's on every hosting platform, wherever streaming stuff. Alex listens, what was your question again?
It was a statement, there was no question.
Okay, what was the statement?
My supervisor once told me that academia is really just people wanting to learn about their own stories and represent their own worlds.
Yeah.
And initially I was like, fuck you, Leah. That's not what it is.
Yeah.
I know that my work is exclusively on understanding the queer Egyptian experience, but fuck you for that statement.
Well, how do you feel? Do you feel like... Okay, so I guess we've got to try... Challenging thing about this talk is that we've got to try and link everything back to this kind of virtual existence. But do you feel like you have... By, for example, talking to this young person in Egypt, do you feel like, or have there been other kind of cyber experiences that you've had that have allowed you to do what your supervisor said you were going to do through academia, which is discover your own narrative?
I would go so far as to say that academia is gate-kept by the cyber world. Whether or not that is, because my research is, within criminology, and so whether or not that is where funding is, where digital criminology and cyber criminology and the Silk Road and selling drugs online, where all of that sexy research that gets all the funding, whether or not, it's that, or whether it is not being able to represent yourself or not being able to have your work out there without being online is a really, really big gatekeeping factor if you work in the queer space. So before I was publicly out, despite how much I fundamentally reject that model, despite how much I fundamentally reject the idea of needing to come out, before I was publicly out, at least to my family, I couldn't be on Twitter as a big gay Egyptian budding academic, because that's going to have some safety implications. And so what that means is if I go and present at conferences, last year I presented at one, and people were quoting me, and they were quoting my paper, and they were quoting my work, and I got to enjoy none of that clout. I got to enjoy none of that clout or none of that opportunity to go further with these other big academics that were spotlighting my work, because I couldn't be on Twitter publicly doing the work that I was doing, because that kind of puts me at risk. And so in some ways, and I know a lot of people that are in a similar position that can't be on Twitter or that can't be on these academic sites for whatever reason, and are held back in their careers, because that is partially what is contingent, or that what dictates success, is that your work needs to get out there somehow. I can't plug it. I can't go ahead and share it around my networks. If I attach my name, the second I attached my name, Julie Youssef, to something I wrote that was queer, that is a really distinct decision that you have to make and that you have to live with. Are you prepared for the consequences of now being out? I can sit there and I can say that the notion of coming out itself is a fundamentally Western construct, and as an Egyptian woman, I would perceive my sexuality differently, as just gay. I feel like you and I have spoken about this before, but at least in the Egyptian sense, there's no word for gay in the Arabic language, right? I mean, I can give you like a very brief impromptu Arabic lesson.
Please.
All right, let's learn some words. All right, let's learn some words. Okay. If you were going to ask someone, how do you identify? What is behind that question, aside from to affirm and to respect someone's gender or sexuality? How do you identify? In English, I have so much that's available to me. Alex, how do you identify?
Me?
How do you personally,
How do I identify?
Aleks Hammo, identify?
Well, I guess one thing that comes to mind are my pronouns,
Yep.
which are he, him.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing which comes to mind is my sexuality. Another thing which comes to mind is my ethnic, racial background, the languages I speak.
Sure. How would you describe your sexuality?
Well, yeah, I guess there are one experience I had earlier this year was using a dating app.
Yep.
And I guess it was an alternative dating app that was recommended to me by a friend. And they had this incredible list of choices.
Yes.
And there were so many that I guess some of them I'd never heard of, like you said in first year, in your first year of uni, when you heard, was it genderqueer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I guess I would choose one of those words.
Pick from all of that long-ass list.
Yeah.
There's so much. If I have anyone, how do you... in the front row. She's queer. She can use queer, right? I would say queer, I'm gay, I'm a lesbian. In Arabic, what do we have? You can have shaz, you can have luti, you can have manharaf, you can have khawal. What do these mean? I'll tell you what these mean. In order of what I just said, we have pervert, we have deviant, we have sodomite. All of these words are what the Arabic language has to express queerness. There is literally no word in Arabic for gay. That is not a slur. And so even to begin with that, and so I can't sit there and go, I don't like the idea of coming out. Coming out as what? I'm going to sit down and tell my mom, I need to tell you something, man. I'm a deviant. I've been like this my whole life. I was born this way. I'm just a sodomite. I'm a sodomite, blood and proud. You can't come out as what, right? And so that's a narrative that I reject. And yet, when you're online, that is a decision that you have to make, that you have had to come out. I've subjected myself in being on Twitter and being on Find an Academic or whatever. I have to have it there that I'm gay and that my research is concerned with this.
And so when
Put me out.
Yeah, right. So when at that conference, when people were citing your work and talking about you, and you weren't yet part of the kind of ecosystem of, maybe people who were either safe expressing their identity or, maybe had taken steps to protect themselves and then express their identity or something. Did you feel like you were being called to express yourself in a way that was authentic? Did you feel like you were being called to express who you were in a way that you wanted to do so in a public platform? And I guess that's, a puzzling thing about academia now is that it seems to be predominantly an online, or its frontiers, its boundaries are dictated by, what is searched for, what is shared. So yeah, how...
I felt left out of my own work because I was only ever being represented in the meta sense. It was only ever people talking about me, whether or not it was about my work and how fabulous it was, even though it was really nice and encouraging. It was always about me rather than what I would have liked to say. This isn't what I wouldn't have said. I wouldn't have said it like that. But sure, if you want to interpret it like that, by all means. But it left me feeling left out of my own work.
And so how have you had some kind of journey of trying to reclaim the meaning of your work? Because now are you on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter now. I'm a Twitter baddie.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's been good. But part of that has been making the decision, once you are on there and once it's there, it's there.
Yeah, right.
And you have to be ready for that. You have to make that decision that anyone can now search for you. And the choice that you've had to make, the compromise that you've had to make has been, do I compromise some of my safety for the sake of being able to participate in work?
And I guess so when I started the talk, I gave everyone this binary. There's the social media self, and then the kind of curious internet searching self. And if you were, I guess, one thing that some academics might have, a straight white guy philosopher, I guess most philosophers are straight white guys who are alive today, they wouldn't have this challenge of having to, I guess, worry about the safety or worry about the dangers which would accompany a genuine expression of their identity into the internet realm. And I guess what's especially curious about your position is that you work in criminology and you're interested in punishment and crime and transgression. So how have you tried to, what are the risks that you had to think about in expressing your identity online? And, how did you end up making the decision to actually do so?
So the central risks they were sort of twofold. Number one, the people on a local scale. I'm talking about the local Egyptian community who are not so queer friendly. And number two was literally the Egyptian state. So the last time I went back to Egypt, I still have so much family there. I'm still very, very much connected. Was, last summer, I was in there for a few months, just before Corona hit, actually. And what I was wondering was, is the next time I come home, am I going to be fucking arrested? There was a member of the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. They're one of the premier human rights NGOs that operate in Cairo. And their members are routinely arrested and detained arbitrarily. One of whom was a master's student. He worked there briefly. He was in Italy studying in Bologna. He came back to Egypt for a few weeks just to visit his family over Christmas, and he's been detained ever since, Patrick Zaki. And so this is the kind of thing that it doesn't really matter what I might think of it, is that there's actually a proper risk here in that I'm putting myself online. I'm hoping that the fact that I have a different name in Arabic, when I go over there, you take your dad's first name as your last name. I'm hoping that might be perhaps a guard, but it's certainly something I have to take into consideration.
Yeah, right. And one thing we spoke about, I guess I've already asked you this question, but one other thing that we spoke about when we were kind of in the bounds of this question was, what does it mean? I guess what happens to the expression of the self when it is done in light of, when it acknowledges the risks and consequences that follow it? Because I believe there is something I guess I imagine most people here would believe that there is something extremely important in being able to freely express who you are. And I guess for both of us as children of parents from the Middle East, North Africa region living in a predominantly white country, we look different. We come from different language backgrounds. And there isn't, I guess, you asked me before about how I felt constructing my kind of identity as someone who speaks to people on the internet.
Your brand, so to speak.
My brand.
You have to commercialize it.
One thing that I have only recently thought about is what it will mean if I ever choose to go back. If I ever choose to go to Algeria, which is where my dad's from. And I guess I've spoken not so much about current Algerian politics, but I guess I did a few episodes on the kind of French Algeria and the colonial encounter. And I guess I've interviewed some people who, are kind of on the fence about Muslim states. And so I guess retrospectively, I'm kind of undergoing this process of realizing that I may have already committed myself to some kind of, I don't know, as you said, like, is there a punishment that could potentially await us for oversharing or for trying to genuinely express something that is part of our identity? One place where we wanted to take this conversation was to constructing, a form of internet use or a platform or something that would allow people to freely express who they are and to comment on things which are dear to them. Did you have any ideas about how that could come about?
Yes, I do. I think it's a farce. And I think it's fundamentally limited by the place in which we're living, right? In the West, you can very freely write and write about whatever you'd like, right? You have that entire knowledge that's available to you. And like we said earlier, you have those search terms, you have the world at your fingertips. But I think it's really important for us to consider that we're in a bubble. And this was something that was elucidated even kind of funnily during the pandemic when people were commenting and sharing about Dictator Dan. The fact that you're able to talk about Dictator Dan means that you don't live in a dictatorship, girl. You don't live under a dictatorship. You have the freedom to talk about Dictator Dan and no masks and this and that. Your rights are a luxury. They're a luxury that in North Africa we do not have. Egyptians and queers that are living under the Egyptian state do not have this luxury to talk about Dictator Sisi. If you talk about Dictator Sisi, you can talk about Dictator Sisi from the cells. You can talk about that from the cells. And so when we're considering, part of the work that I find, what I find so difficult about working in this space, initially when I started writing about the queer Egyptian experience, I was really upset by the fact that all of the authors that were writing about it were white academics based abroad, normally in the US, some in Melbourne. And I got really disenchanted by can I help you? I was really disenchanted by the fact that no one that looked like me was writing about me and about the people that were also living the same life that I was and that were struggling with the same things and that were struggling against the same structural oppressors. And I realized that the reason for which none of the work that I would like to see come out of Egypt itself and why that work doesn't actually come out of there is because it's not safe to. A lot of my cousins were working in NGOs during the revolution, during the 2011 uprising, who now cannot because NGOs are shut down routinely, let alone queer NGOs. And so what that means for representing the queer Egyptian narrative in an ethical manner is that the burden fundamentally falls on people like you and I in the diaspora to tell these stories. And that is a hell of a burden that you'd better take pretty fucking seriously. Otherwise, what we do is we risk reproducing these Orientalist dynamics that have previously condemned the Middle East and North African region to being seen as primitive, backwards, and savage. And so it's the people that are in these spaces, on internet spaces and in workspaces, I'll call them workspaces, academic spaces, that really want to make a difference and that really want to help and that see the suffering and see how awful it is in the Egyptian context and think, well, shit, how can I help? And use their Western knowledges, right? Using their own knowledge and using their own epistemology will impose that onto the Egyptian experience. As someone who is sitting in the West and is witnessing Egypt from here, I can see that you are oppressed and the way that the Egyptian state is constructing sexuality is like this. And so we see all of this misinformation circulating about what's happening, and it sucks, right? And so what this means is that we need to be engaging with online spaces in an ethical way that is, number one, allowing the voices that we want to be heard, allowing them to be put at the forefront, and allowing those to be uplifted. People are not going out and doing the research. People are asking their own echo chambers what they think is what's going on. And then that knowledge is being reproduced because there are no safety barriers for us here. Anyone can get on their soapbox. Anyone can build a following and have clout in the safety of this West, in this sanctuary, and reproduce knowledge, whether incorrect or otherwise. And so ironically, it's the people that really, really want to help, really truly want to help, that end up inadvertently reproducing Orientalist binaries and Orientalist discourses. And so it kind of leaves you and I at a place of, we need to reclaim these spaces. And whether or not that puts us at risk is something that we need to mitigate on a case-to-case basis and on a need-to-know basis. I don't want to put my head on everything. All I care about is liberating the queers of Egypt, you know.
Yeah, there are two things that come to mind after hearing that. The first is that it sounds like a real concern is that Westerners who are using whatever platform they have, whether it's academia or social media or anything like that, that there is a risk that colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism is going to be perpetuated because there is a failure to, I guess there is, some kind of colonial savior complex where there is a reaching out from one part of the world to another. As you spoke before about how, in queer communities there is a coming out culture, and that is something that the West tries to impose on countries outside of the West, and that can have consequences. Like, as you said, when you try and apply that to the Arabic-speaking world, there is an absence of words to describe or to positively describe the sexual identity.
And that's because the MENA region doesn't see sexuality as something inherent to you.
MENA is Middle East, North Africa.
Yes. They don't see it as something that is inherent to you, right? So but the way that I would describe it is that, when you did high school languages, I did French in high school, and it was a big thing learning about how to express that you're cold or hot. You say that I have cold or I have hot. And that's how much I would liken it to sexuality in the MENA region, is that I am not gay. I'm not a gay person. I have gay. I have proclivities to the same genders. That kind of makes sense. And so naturally, why would I use a word like gay? All of the other words are slurs. I don't see myself like that. And so we see this, they call it a Stonewall model, right? That queerness started with Stonewall in the US. And sure, it may well have in that context with Marsha P. Johnson, but in the MENA region, we don't see it like that. And so outsourcing this Stonewall model and really wanting to impose that onto people in the MENA region causes harm. It causes harm. Come out. Come out as what, man? That's not how it works here.
So then what? Because, as I said before, I guess us, people in this part of the world, people outside of the Middle East, North Africa region, trying to assist in the Middle East, North Africa region, how can that be done? Because you said before that and I agree with you, it is the responsibility of people who can freely articulate whatever it is that they wish to articulate to elevate voices of people who can't do so. But how can that be done without I guess, adding to or reinforcing, oppression and prejudice and exclusion?
That is an excellent question. And I can perhaps respond to this question by using a case study, if that's all right. Was everyone familiar with, in 2017, has anyone ever heard of Mashrua Leila? Will has. They're a Lebanese indie rock band. Their lead singer is one of the only openly gay figures in the whole region. And they came and performed a concert in Cairo in 2017. 35,000 people were there. It was massive. It went off. During this concert, some people were photographed raising pride flags. No big deal. Well, it was for the Egyptian state. It was one of the first times this had probably happened in history since the revolution, and it prompted one of the largest crackdowns on queer Egyptians since 2001. So you had over 80 people that were rounded up and arrested, a lot of whom didn't even go to the concert themselves, but were rounded up in this big morality crusade that the state was trying to perpetuate. One of whom was a friend of mine, and her name was Sarah Higazi. And what happened to her, she was the only woman that was arrested. She was rounded up, she was arrested, she was imprisoned and tortured for 3 months, where she was ultimately released on bail to await 15 years or more in prison for a charge of joining an outlawed group, which is, by the way, a charge that is vague enough to imply that it's going to be used to charge terrorism and terrorists, but is vague enough to be adapted to be like whoever is an enemy of the state, pretty much. And so in this particular instance, it was wielded against a queer woman. So she was let out on bail after 3 months, and she was ultimately able to seek asylum in Canada. And the way that she describes being in Canada and being under the loving wing of Justin Trudeau it was purely a question of optics and purely a question of like internet clout. So Trudeau, who is like really famous for his sunny politicking on Twitter, really famously, like they brought in some Syrian refugees and he was photographed putting coats on little Syrian refugee children as they got off the plane, and he would tell them, "You're safe in Canada now," and it was a great photo op. And after the Trump travel ban, he said, "We will welcome you here. Everyone is welcome to Canada." And what happened was, after all was said and retweeted, nothing. And so how do we do this in an ethical way? We can't rely on governments because irrespective of how they're going to exploit the queer body, whether it is to propose a narrative of queerness is a Western imposition that is a danger and a threat to the moral fabric of Egyptian society, or whether it is because queer bodies are valuable and they reinforce a particular state narrative as liberal and open and democratic, we can't rely on governments because they will exploit the body. What she did ultimately say was that she found the biggest helping hand through civil society.
By she, you mean Sarah Higazi?
Yes. By she, I mean Sarah Higazi. So what she found was that ultimately it was the people that were in activist spaces and that were in intellectual spaces and that were in academic spaces, it was a question of an equal exchange of ideas. One in which you can actually... in order to have this discussion, you need to deconstruct some of the central ideas that you're working with, some of which you may have even taken for granted that you had internalized. Such as, for example, that people in Egypt don't come out because there's no word to come out as. People in Egypt don't see themselves as queer. They see themselves as just themselves with a proclivity. It's more of a performance of gender type thing, right? And so in order to do that, you need to work with a bunch of decolonizing sort of methodologies and unlearn a lot of what you have ingrained to you and a lot of what you take as granted and as normal.
And relating this back to, I guess my hope is that we can have some pragmatic, practical takeaways for people. So for the Westerner who can freely navigate the internet, what should they do? For the person who isn't in academia and who isn't publishing, what should they do?
The internet is, as much as I said earlier, it's a difficult space. You need to know where to look and how to look and who you're looking for. Once you have the names of people that are representing themselves in a particular way, that is authentic, that is true, everything that you said earlier, that's who you need to hang on to. We don't need to hear people talking about Egyptian queers. We want to hear from Egyptian queers. That is the best place. You got to get it from, the mouth of the horse or whatever. What is the expression? Is it the mouth of the horse? The horse's mouth. Well, there you go. The mouth of the horse. You need to get it from the horse's mouth, right? You need to be finding the people themselves. We're no longer talking about people. We're talking with people. We're letting people represent their own narratives. And so in the Egyptian context where it's dangerous to hear it directly from Egypt, you should be hearing from and listening to people in the diaspora. And you should be, more importantly, stepping aside when necessary, using your position to ensure, actually, you know what, maybe I shouldn't be teaching in this area. Maybe I shouldn't be speaking on this. Maybe I can direct you to someone else. Maybe I can direct you to the page of these people that you can support and learn from. Because I'm not the authority on this. That's fine.
Are you aware of, do you think this is much of a practice that's actually happening anywhere? Have you seen this being done by anyone, the kind of gesturing towards people who, whose voices, gesturing towards the diaspora instead of speaking on behalf of them, or gesturing towards people who are actually from a particular country rather than an academic who is not from that country but writes on it from afar?
For sure. I think we're seeing an increasing tendency to allow people to... We're seeing that the slogan of nothing about us without us, which is used a lot in the Indigenous space and it works really well. And I think people using that are starting to put that into practice. Is this something that is important for you when you're speaking to people, when you're engaging with people, that you're providing that space to do so?
Yeah, I guess so. I think it's something that I hope to do more of, because I think most of the conversations and interviews that I do are more about kind of abstract, intangible philosophy, which is very interesting for me, but I guess often not intimately connected to kind of real world political consequences, especially with, the Middle East, North Africa region. But yes, it is something that is very important for me. And I guess I try and carry an attitude in kind of general socializing that allows people to, talk about.
And even beyond the Middle East and North Africa, this is something that you can put into practice in every aspect of your life by diversifying, right? So much of what we see as the norm and as a hegemonic norm is there because of the power structures of white supremacy and heteronormativity and compulsory heterosexuality that mean that those particular voices and books and texts are all embedded into the system. But where you have the opportunity to diversify it, do it, right? So when I'm teaching in the academic space, if I can replace a text that is 50 years old, that has no bearing, or that if your entire set list, if your entire book list is all white, all pale, all stale, all male, maybe consider where you're getting your information from, because I guarantee you that exact thing was said earlier by someone ethnic. Was it not? It was said.
Yeah.
It was said.
And I think one cool exercise that I did in my final philosophy subject was actually trying to define what philosophy was. And I feel like, for me, that task, the task of trying to, trace a word, I guess not so much etymology. We weren't kind of going back to, the OG Greek roots or whatever.
Philo.
But I guess what we did, or what I did, was try and think about what I wanted it to mean. And I guess what it meant for me in my life. And I think that would be something that would be very helpful for people to try and understand that, when we study philosophy, or when we study anything, or when we read anything, I guess we're only being presented with someone else's curated definition or list of what constitutes that particular
And
thing.
someone else's structural benefits in their ability to navigate that system. If you're talking about like the publish or perish model of academia, who is able to rise to the ranks, whose research is not controversial enough, whose research is not going to really shake the bounds of the institution such that they're able to rise to a position of structural privilege where they can make a difference, where they can empower the next generation of young minds. What kind of research is that? I'll tell you what, it's that shitty ass, stale ass, digital criminology shit. Get out of here. It's so boring. I was a bit of a rant. I apologize for that. But we need to acknowledge that the people that are in positions of power are there for a number of reasons that were beyond their control.
Yeah, okay.
Number of privileges.
Again, trying to bring this back to I guess, modes of using the internet. I think that one thing that would have been, you said earlier that we're not given like a handbook for, hygienic, good internet use. But I imagine that because the algorithm is something that is fed by kind of popularity, but, is also something that is authored to take people in a particular direction. I imagine that, with an awareness of what the internet can present people, both social media, as this kind of scrolling newsfeed of infinite pieces of information, and then I guess search engines, which are also kind of infinite scrolling pages of information, but are more directed. I think, it'd be helpful for people to be taught how to use the internet as a resource, and how to kind of reshape the algorithm so that it isn't...
How do you recommend that be done? What are you proposing?
Well, I guess it just seems like such a grand task that I guess I wouldn't really know where to begin, and I'm not too literate in, what composes an algorithm and how to change it. But I think I would return to that original binary that I proposed. So understanding that the internet can be used in primarily two different ways. One, as a means of projecting a kind of constructed identity, which can be helpful, right? If you want to hide something about yourself. So if you wanted to be on social media in a way that wasn't going to put you at risk of something, you can do that by curating your profile so it looks to be a particular way. But I think that is markedly different from, and it also comes from a very different part of our being when compared to the kind of curious searching self that I often like, that I've discovered that I have, which is this kind of, I find myself, looking up things and reading stuff and watching videos and watching tutorials. And I bet all of us have kind of, some people's rabbit holes are, perhaps less...
That's between them and God.
Yeah.
Those rabbit holes are between them and God. That's none of our concern. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But I think knowing that they're not one and the same, that the body that exists on social media doesn't have to be the body that is searching for meaning on the internet. I think that would be a really important lesson to learn. So I guess that would be somewhere where I'd start, trying to teach people that there is, I think there is a difference between, there can be a difference, and you can be more safe.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
What do you think?
I would agree with that.
Okay.
I would agree with that.
Do you think, okay. Do you think that, so I had this idea, okay, no, I had this idea that there could be okay, so one thing that is, okay, one thing that seems to be really important for impacting people's decision-making on the internet is whether a site is free or not. Because if a site is free, then, as if it's free to use, then I guess the only way that the owners of that site are going to make money is by A, harvesting your information and selling it to ad companies, or B, from ad revenue by actually having ads on the page. So I had this, I guess, I had this idea that I bet, like, you know, some smart Silicon Valley people have already had, of an alternative browser that is totally free from advertising. I think that would be a really cool way to have like a really nice, streamlined, authentic internet experience that is like totally libidinal and like driven by like real emotion and not kind of subverted and morphed and changed by ads and stuff. So that was a thought I had.
Yeah, you should monetize that.
Well, thanks. But I don't know how to do that, and I don't think anyone would, like, you can't, who's going to use my bullshit browser?
I would use your bullshit browser.
Thank you. Pay as well?
Maybe.
There you go. Anyway, that was just the thought. But yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
Perhaps
and we were hoping to get to a Q&A. I didn't realize it was 3:53. So was there anything else you
I have
wanted to
nothing else to add, but I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff in a variety of different ways. I hope we didn't bore you, but I would totally understand if you felt as though there wasn't so much of a linear trajectory through all of the things we spoke about. So feel free to ask anything that comes to mind. The nice person in the front.
I've got a recommendation first and a question. Recommendation is an add-on called...
Ooh, recommendation and a question.
Recommendation is a Google Chrome add-on called AdBlock, which blocks all advertising from your browser and is free.
I do love that add-on.
And the question is, do you think that like different platforms and their kind of like formal like design qualities produce different authentic selves?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. So I was thinking about this on the way here because I tried to plug this talk primarily through Instagram because I don't like Facebook very much. And I think it was at my expense that I didn't promote through Facebook. But I noticed as I was trying to like write up a post to Facebook that it elicited a very different kind of prose, and my mood was very different, and the image of my audience was very different. So I guess, yeah, to answer your question, yes, I think that that different platforms definitely do elicit different versions of ourselves, different social media ones. And then I guess I think there'd be even more difference between how one interacts with Instagram versus YouTube versus Wikipedia. And there would be varying different levels of authenticity between them. Like, I think it'd be pretty hard to have a really inauthentic Wikipedia rabbit hole because I guess it's so demanding of attention and like interest that, yeah, I guess it's cool if you go down a rabbit hole. Whereas I feel like things like YouTube and Facebook often, just because I guess you're being presented with information on a different medium, it's easier to kind of slip into a numb kind of scroll. But I would say that's less authentic. So
wait, Julie, the people that you research that reach out to you, do you think that like the platforms that they engage with, because they're coming from like Silicon Valley and like are being designed and kind of infrastructurally built in the West, that like shapes the way that they form their identities online?
For sure. We're seeing like an almost internet imperialism taking place where the only time you can really access that area of the internet, if you want your algorithm to work on like TikTok, say, is you have to follow that hashtag. You have to get into the hashtag. And that's already a hashtag that is inauthentic to you. If I want to find some cool gay Egyptian content, I have to go down a gay Egyptian rabbit hole. And that's already representing myself in a manner that I wouldn't really see as authentic. That's how I'd respond to that. Yeah.
Any other questions? Wow.
No one's getting
So
coronavirus today.
1.5 meters, everyone. I was talking about this to my friend the other day about like sexual, like labeling on sexual identity, like, because like I don't consider myself sort of like I don't want to like label myself, because like it could be like I could call myself questioning, I could be calling myself like gender fluid,
For sure.
but like where I grew up in, like I grew up in Japan, and like there's no like law enforcement if I come out, but that social pressure, if I come out, there's like a real consequence, like I might lose a job, or something. I'm not going back to Japan, but so it doesn't matter. But still, like that labeling is like not something that I feel comfortable, because like how come like I have to be labeling myself?
That's it.
Like I can be like fluid, like in like that. And I don't want to see anyone like with the label either. Like, why do we have to see that? Like keep labeling things.
Yeah.
So I just like kind of curious, like what you think about that, like labeling, like sexual identity.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good question, and I really agree with the pressure of people need to label you in order to relate to like how am I supposed to respond to you. That's like it's like that. I'm sure you've got it. Like, oh, but where are you from? Because I need this to fit within the codes that I have. And based on your response, I'm going to make a decision as to how I perceive you. And so those labels are really fucking oppressive. But at the same time, I found a little bit of solace in acknowledging and reclaiming that the label is the label and I can do whatever I want with it. I don't necessarily have to use it. But I found that there was also, at least in my case, and I speak for myself and myself only, that there really was a bit of a power in being that label or embodying that label, whether people like it or not. And it really, I've been having a lot of discussions and doing some work around conversion therapy in my community. And there's just such a power in being like, yeah, and? Fuck you gonna do about it? So that's why I put it. But at the same time, on the questions of labels, they're pretty oppressive, but sometimes, they can provide you with the freedom of like, once I'm in it and I can't come back from it, at least now I can do whatever I want with it. But I acknowledge that it's like a very imperfect system and it's what we have. And so open to alternatives,
Cool, thank you. Any other questions? Cool. Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for coming, everyone.